is Katie Nelson, and my wife and I are the caretakers here at the Randolph Homestead. And just last week we had a baby. My wife and I had a baby. So I haven't had a ton of sleep, so you have to forgive me for trying to piece together my sentences up here. But I always just am so grateful to host artists in residence, especially ones like Reilly. Have been just so grateful to have your creativity and are so excited to see what you have in store for us today. And we are just so grateful also to partner with Open Air. When this place was first envisioned as a community and cultural site, having artists in residence was one of the goals. But as you know, run by a caretaker like myself, who's just part-time and has to take care of everything you see here, we never had the capacity to recruit artists on our own, host them, and show their work. And so it's been so amazing to have this partnership with Open Air to be able to bring artists like Reilly to this site and showcase their work and let this place inspire people, which it is so prone to do. So if you don't already know, this site is a historic site. It's owned by the city of Missoula. It's part of the city of Missoula's conservation lands. Pretty unique aspect of the conservation lands. We're known as the Randolph Homestead, and that is to commemorate the lives of the Moon and Randolph families who one after another lived here for about 100 years. And that's named that because of most of the visible artifacts and buildings that we have on site were built and left by these two families. Of course, history did not begin in 1889, and there are 14,000 years and beyond of human history in this place, particularly with the Salish peoples. And the road that you guys drove up to get here is a well-worn Salish trail that would go over the hillside, out to bison hunting grounds in the plains, to flint digging grounds up the Clark Fork Valley, to camas digging grounds, and even just to here, to where there have been wild American plums for thousands of years, probably inspired the planting of this apple orchard by the homesteaders, and bitterroot digging grounds in the hills that surround us. So it's so important for us to acknowledge that history and the complicated history of homesteading and agriculture in this place. But I'm so glad to welcome you here on a day when the clouds parted for this event. And without further ado, we'll turn it over to Reilly.
I'm just going to read it.
Thank you. My name's Reilly, and I predominantly make furniture. So this image is one of the first pieces of furniture I ever made, which is a bench made out of wood and then covered with a paper pulp texture, so it kind of looks like it's made out of stone, although it's very much not. But yeah, I'm from Atlanta originally, which, if you've never been, is one of the, it is the city in the US that I believe has the most dense tree canopy. So really heavily forested, really, really lush landscape, but also has a ton of roads, and is very much a victim of urban sprawl. So there's this interesting tension between the plant life and the land and the roads, and how things are developing now, and as it's a city that's growing really rapidly, how it's kind of changing. So that's something that I think about a lot and is kind of always top of the mind. And I draw a lot of roads. And I think it's because I spend a lot of time in the car driving. I'm always driving on roads, thinking about infrastructure and how everything sort of layers on top, how we get from place to place, and how it's maybe inefficient and bad sometimes. So yeah, lots of drawings of roads, wires, pylons. This is kind of stuff I do casually in my sketchbook at all times, always. Suburbs, the weird kind of how things look the same in a lot of suburban communities across the country. So that's kind of one thread of thought that's always top of the mind. But probably the greatest influence on my work is a couple of Southern folk artists that I'll speak about. So the South is kind of haunted by the Bible and a lot of the most prolific artists from the South deal with really spiritual or religious themes. One of my favorite artists is Sister Gertrude Morgan, who's a woman from, she kind of moved around different areas, was in Columbus, Georgia for a while, then went to New Orleans, but she does these really kind of childlike and graphic drawings that have a lot of text, and the text is often really religious in theme. I think her work is really fun and also really strange. Another kind of group of artists, the Quilts of Gee's Bend, if you're not familiar, they're a group of women in Alabama, predominantly black women, who make these like totally incredible quilts. They've been making them for years. It's kind of a matrilineal practice that they pass down through the community. In contrast to a lot of American patchworking traditions, they don't use like premeditated patterns. It's really intuitive, the way that they build shape and form. And their work became really popular. For like the longest time, it was kind of contained within the community, and they were making these things to like use in a practical way in their homes. And then some like fancy New York people discovered them, and they had the show, I think at the MoMA in the 70s, and then all of these like abstract expressionist artists like Mark Rothko and all these guys kind of co-opted their aesthetic, I think, a little bit, or like were definitely very inspired by them. But anyways, I love their work, and I've always been really inspired by them. I grew up making patchwork quilts. I used to go to quilting camp when I was a kid every summer. Yeah, it's like really weird. But yeah, this is a quilt I made that's like, it has so many really small diamonds cut on the bias. So it's this kind of like really obsessive repetition, minutia type of thing. I really like color and pattern, and so quilts are so graphic and like a really good way to explore that. A couple of years ago, I did a residency in Nebraska in a really small community that was kind of just surrounded by industrial farms for corns and soybeans, where each block was like a mile square of like scary farm. And that was when I first kind of became aware of the scale of America and like how the food system here is supported, and just how crazy the agricultural system is, kind of, because in the East, all the farms are really small. They're really like, there's more water, things are smaller and denser, and I never really realized how big and vast this continent was until I drove out there. I started doing all of these drawings, which had like a lot of grid, thinking about the grid and sort of thinking about the repetition of the blocks and the shapes. And then at the same time, serendipitously, the like preeminent quilt museum in the world is in Lincoln, Nebraska, the International Quilt Museum. It's incredible. I went there and I did a little bit of research there, and was like while kind of being immersed in this really vast and strange landscape, was like looking at all of these quilts and getting hands-on experience with a lot of these pieces that I'd only read about in books before. So again, kind of grids, colors, patterns, but in a completely different sense. And then I started making these pieces, patchworking pieces, that kind of distilled the grid that I was surrounded by into this like abstracted, I'm gonna say map, but kind of color and pattern. And yeah, I called it an agri-quilt, where it kind of like reflected the landscape that I was in, but was also like very much the product of all of the research I was doing at the Quilt Museum at the same time. So yeah, I'm always kind of thinking about patchworking, color, pattern, and making things that in theory can be used or like put in your house and like wrapped up in. I don't really like it when art becomes precious, when you like finish it and then it's like a fancy thing that you can't touch. This is some more patchworking I've done, just like studio shots. And another thing that I do, not only with quilting, but with other media as well, is like trying to mimic the place that I'm in. So this is just a sketch, but sort of trying to copy the tiling of the floor with fabric. Kind kind of going back to furniture, another piece that I think falls into that thread of mimicry is this desk I made a couple of years ago. I went to school in Rhode Island, and I've been living there for the past like 8-ish years, and there's like beaches there. It's the ocean state, and so I would go on these beach walks all winter long and kind of just stare at the sand and look at all the shells and rocks. And I wanted to make a desk where the tabletop surface was a like reflection of the beach texture. So I made this mold. It's kind of process shots. I collect all these shells, and I wanted to make the desk out of concrete and then have the shells embedded in the top, basically. So created a composition with shells and crystals and various things that accumulated over the course of a few months. Laid down some concrete in a really imprecise way. Created this like metal scaffolding for strength, added some more concrete, and this is like a close-up of the final piece's texture. And I'm kind of showing the process images because making furniture is something that's really meticulous and requires a lot of planning. There's not a lot of like whimsy in making furniture. You're making things that have to be self-supporting. Oftentimes they have to hold a human being. So the design process is really rigid and doesn't really allow for much improvisation or fluidity, which is something I both like and despise. And then, yeah, one more artist from the South, maybe one of my favorites, is Howard Finster. The South is really rich in environmental artists, and by that I don't mean artists who work with land, but rather artists who create like really dense environments of art. So it can be sculpture gardens, they could be transforming their land or like house estate areas into these really immersive art installations in museums. And Howard Finster is one of those people. He has a kind of crazy story. He was I just think this is a fun fact. He was a bike mechanic and a Baptist minister for most of his life. And then in his 60s was painting a bike and got this like piece of white paint on his finger and saw like the outline of a face in the paint, and then the face started talking to him in the voice of God, and it told him to paint divine art. And then from then on he just made art, and his estate claims that he was the most prolific artist of the 20th century, which is like, probably not true, but he made like tens of thousands of paintings and collages and sculptures, often out of trash, and they all kind of have this like biblical overtone. Generally the themes are about love and acceptance and tolerance and like being at peace with the world and other people in your community, which I think is significant given the fact that he is from this like really tiny, rural, really conservative community in Georgia. So I think it's cool that like a lot of the artists from that area that have the most defining legacy are like the good ones. But yeah, he makes these really crazy paintings. And kind of another fun fact is that in the 80s, Athens, Georgia had a really good music scene. The B-52s, REM, like all these bands came out of there. Those were the famous ones. But the guys from REM became friends with Howard Finster and would like drive up to his estate and just hang out with him and sing with him because he played the banjo and sang. And then they filmed the video for Radio Free Europe in his sculpture garden. And then he did the album art for Reckoning. And then David Byrne found out and was like, this guy's cool. And he did the album art for Little Creatures by the Talking Heads. And then I think he won album cover of the year for that. So just like a crazy thing, because he kind of just was a homebody and like stayed in his little Georgia home and got all this international attention without really trying to or explicitly seeking it out. But yeah, just a fun fact. And so I went to his estate for the first time in like 2019, and it was awesome. I probably cried. It was like, it's just like beautiful. There's so much art. And then I went back last fall, and it was a really different experience because I think his estate doesn't have a lot of money, and a lot of stuff had kind of like decayed a little bit, or like nothing was being preserved explicitly, which is kind of like, that's life. And he has so much art that it's impossible to preserve everything. He never used archival materials or anything like that. So I kind of think that like is interesting to think about in the context of this place, which is like very accepting of like decay and change and structures and like things. But I don't know, I think it's a little different with like something that's explicitly fine art. It made me a little sad to see things kind of changing. And then like one last anecdote about him is, so I don't know if you can really see, but on the left he has this like kind of participatory art invitation where he's asking people to send notes that he'll put in his coffin with him when he gets buried, and they're like supposed to be nice notes. And his whole kind of place where his whole estate has this really participatory like spirit to it. You can touch stuff, you like are very much in the place with the art. It's super different than being in a museum where there's this like, you know, bulletproof glass between the piece of art and you. And so on the right I have a picture from the Breakers, which is the former like Vanderbilt summer house in Newport, Rhode Island that you can tour now. There's a bunch of mansions in Newport. And they had all these signs. I went last December and I thought it was really funny. They had all these signs on like the bathtub and like in the kitchen in front of the pots. And here it's like a fake plant with a fake bird in it, and it says, "Now more than ever, please do not touch." Which I thought was like so strange and weird. Like, and I just think that's like a really interesting dichotomy of like, you know, like write a note and I'll put it in my coffin with my corpse versus like don't touch our fake bird. Like, it just like doesn't make sense. So that's something I think about a lot with art, is like why things become precious when you're done making it. Which brings me back to furniture, I think. Yeah, furniture. So furniture, you make something, you spend all this time making this beautiful object, and then you like sit on it or you like put stuff on it. So it's a really like participatory way of making art and being creative, and like you're making things that are used every day and ideally aren't so precious that you like don't even want to touch them. So I kind of wanted to show some like a couple furniture projects I've worked on, and the process kind of reinforcing the idea of furniture design as a really rigid thing, and also sort of showing how I've like used different materials. And yeah, I will say, like, when I say I'd make furniture, it's never like a West Elm type of furniture. It's always kind of weird and sculptural, which there is a like really cool movement of furniture artists kind of around the world, furniture designers, I guess, making more sculptural and like artistic work. This is my card table. And when I was in school, I got really interested in stone inlay and stone carving. But it's a really expensive and difficult material and process to learn. So I started working with linoleum, and I have some samples up here. Y'all can like touch later. I don't know where they are, but oh, it's over there. But it's like a material that's often printed to look like marble, but it's really thin, machines and cuts really well. And it's something that kind of a lower material that was often used as an alternative to stone. So I wanted to experiment with how I could inlay it and use it as a surface, kind of co-opting the methodology of quilting for this other material and process. So I probably started with sketchbook sketches, but I could not find them. So I often will design things on the computer for furniture. So this is like a sketch of the sort of the joinery that I was going to do for this piece. Modeling, sort of testing out different dimensions and heights. Drawing I think I drew everything in my sketchbook first, and then I sort of translated it into the computer, and laid everything out there and sort of have everything color-coded for the different colors of linoleum. Testing colors out in Illustrator because there's so many colors of linoleum, trying to get the best idea of how things will look. And then in the studio, kind of zhuzhing. And this is the finished piece, sort of the tabletop. So it's like smooth, and all the linoleum sort of inlays in together. And that's a process I got really excited about and have sort of continued to work with since I made this piece. And then like I think I actually have a couple more furniture pieces, but this is my chair, which also kind of uses the patchwork quilting, the color blocking, all of that stuff is like always stuff that I make. So yes, always start with like a pencil sketch, and then take it to the computer and try to render it to the greatest degree of accuracy possible, which is like an essential thing for building something. It helps a lot, but it also takes out a lot of the improvisation that a painter can do, for example. In the studio, I like often have to make full-scale mock-ups of things to really understand the scale and how they like look and sort of are in a space. So I like put brown paper on to sort of test out how the upholstery would look, and then I would like kind of squat in it to like pretend like I was sitting in it, but I couldn't actually sit in it because I would like fall. And that's like the frame, oiling the frame, and then sort of like testing out patchworking patterns for the upholstery. This is a dog with a ball. And then like carrying the frame. I was like always carrying stuff around in school. And then for the upholstery, I was making this chair during COVID, so I was really into being clean. And so everything can be like removed and washed. The green balls actually screw off. This kind of clips off. There's like seatbelt clips on the bottom. So I was experimenting a lot with skin and frame structures and how I could work like in a more lightweight way. So yeah, the backrest can kind of screw off, but that's the finished piece in some sunlight. And then it's different on the back, so really having fun with color and pattern. And the idea was that I could screw off the balls and then change out the upholstery whenever I wanted, if I got bored of this version. And then I also got sort of interested in working collaboratively. In the past couple of years, I've been doing that more and more. One of my good friends and collaborators, Amos Kang, and we often make furniture together, and I think we'd known each other for a few years, but had never really spoken before, and I think we both had crushes on each other's work, and then eventually started making things together, and we made this shelf together. Shortly after we were in school, we were serendipitously both in Atlanta at the time. So yeah, starting with a computer sketch always. We both sort of resist the process of furniture making, but we still kind of buy into it at times to like be able to make things that are structurally sound. We made this piece out of mostly scrap plywood. I think we bought like a couple pieces from Home Depot maybe, but we sort of just scavenged around looking for stuff. Sort of like putting the frame together. And the idea with this piece was to make it look like it was made out of some really expensive fancy wood, even though it was just plywood. So Amos is really good at airbrushing, and he airbrushed this fake wood texture on the top to make it look like a fancy veneer or something. Not having a studio space at the time, a lot of stuff would happen in my kitchen. That's us painting without any protection for the floor. I feel like I appreciated when Danielle was like transparent about sort of the limitations on her practice at like different points in time. So, a lot of the stuff happens like in my house. That's us testing it out with bubbles. Yeah. Everything has to be fun. And then we thought it would be fun to photograph it in this sort of like Georgia forest landscape. I think it's kind of funny because people think that it's wood, real expensive wood all the time, that it's bent lamination, which is like a fancy furniture technique that we definitely did not use for this. And so it kind of like mimics a real fancy type of wood, even though it's a really low material that we kind of just found in the trash. And then one more piece that Amos and I made together. A couple years ago, a friend of ours was having a show that was all mirrors, and she asked us to make a piece together for it, and we were really interested in the idea of like using the mirror glass as an image making is like part of the image. So rather than making a frame and then having like a mirror inside of it, we wanted to use the mirror to like create some sort of symbols or glyphs. So this is the finished piece, always starting in the computer. We did a lot of collaborative drawings, but we were living in different cities at the time, so we kind of were trying to facilitate this like long distance collaboration. Amos made a model, and I was luckily working at a university sculpture studio while we were making this, so I was able to mooch off of a lot of the machines and CNC the form. This is kind of what it looked like after it came off of the machine. And then that's us again in a driveway because we didn't have a studio space. I think he was living in Atlanta maybe, and I was in Providence, and I think I like carried this really heavy piece of wood on the plane, and then we had like a really short window during Thanksgiving to finish everything and put it together. So that's us putting stain on it. Amos putting on stain. And then again, not having a studio space, we didn't have clamps, which we needed to glue the backing on. I just thought this was kind of funny. We used like an urn and then a collection of like, it's like The World of Matisse, American Painting, 1900 to 1970, like all these books, and then a really heavy mallet, like whatever we could find just in the house of like stuff to clamp down. So, you know, oftentimes making things in an incorrect way, or like using what we can to make it work. And that's the finished piece. So it was kind of cool. We had a really tight deadline, which isn't fun for us usually, but we were able to like pull it all together and kind of figure out this long distance way of working together, which we've continued to do since then. And that's like a detail, so you can kind of see what it looks like, I guess. And then more recently, I've been wanting to get back into the linoleum inlay process that I started, and also I wanted to start making money with art because like I think it's really hard to figure out a way to do that. So yeah, so I was like, okay. Like, I probably should have picked a different picture to put first, but I wanted to make mirrors. I think mirrors are a really fun way of, it's kind of a furniture object. It's something people will buy in theory, but it's something that's not weight bearing. It's kind of just a frame. It's a planar thing, so it doesn't take a lot of material. It doesn't require much engineering, and it's mostly surface, which is what I was interested in. So I really wanted to figure out a way to get better at linoleum inlay and to sort of hone some different techniques while also, in theory, making things that people would want to buy that also were not so hard to make that I would have to charge $1 million for them. Like, I wanted to make things that were a little bit more accessible and, yeah, things that people I knew would be interested in buying. So I was really also had just moved out of a house in Atlanta that was like had a lot of bugs in it, and I don't know if y'all have like been to the South in the summer, but bug season is so scary. There are like roaches that fly at you and are like the size of limes, and also other bugs too. So I was kind of thinking about bugs and bugs being like more resilient than humans potentially, and roaches just doing evolution really fast in a way that is scary. So I wanted to put all these bugs on my mirrors. And I think this is actually an older drawing, but it sort of shows how I draw in my sketchbook. So it's like oftentimes really distracted stuff that like I'll then take all the shapes and put them on the computer and rearrange them, and then that becomes the surface pattern on the piece that I'm making. And then I'll also like take stuff into Illustrator and sort of test out different colors and shapes. But oftentimes my first idea has to change because of the limitations of the material or the machine or the process that I'm using. So like here, there's a lot of really thin legs and pieces that for the type of machining I was doing and for the linoleum, it would be way too fragile to like use. Like if you cut, you know, the wood would just, everything would have broken. So I had to kind of adjust, figure out the minimum like diameter that I could use for any particular part of an image, and then really changed the iconography based on that, which is a kind of a nice collaboration, I think, between the process and like the initial idea. So this kind of shows like a template for more like the math part of the process. So kind of where the mirror glass is, where the backing piece goes, and like where the negative space will be for the inlay that I'm then going to insert. So there's a lot of this kind of thing that I have to do behind the scenes to make things that kind of helps me like understand how stuff layers and like exists in space. And so all of the mirrors that I made were CNC'd, which is a really cool process. If you don't know, it's basically like it's like a giant laser cutter, except instead of a laser, it's like a blade or like a drill bit or a router bit. And you can cut anything almost. And you can cut 2D shapes, which is what I do. So it's mostly like cutouts, but you could also carve with it. And you can do two-sided cuts. It's a really cool and efficient way to make things in multiples and to design more for production. So I was kind of getting more comfortable with that and learning more about that. I was kind of proud of this. This is my nesting, and I was really trying to be as conservative with the material as I could and like waste as little material as possible. And this is kind of crazy, like it's like so thin in between. Which I was working with a machinist in Massachusetts who was really cool about letting me experiment and do things like this. Normally you have to leave like several inches of stock in between any asset that you have. But he really let me experiment and like get kind of hands-on about how much material I could conserve and like ways to kind of cut corners. And then these are all of like the collection before I did the stuff to it, just on my car. I was really excited when I picked it up, so I wanted to take a picture. And then in studio, I skipped some steps, but basically I also cut out all the linoleum and then was like inlaying it in. Some of them are also plywood inlaid in that I dyed or stained, which is either laser cut. I think it's all laser cut. I had access to the university makerspace at the time, so perks of like working at an art department of a college, and was able to kind of go in after hours and like cut things. So yeah, kind of like working with inlay, working with imagery and symbols, and trying to find ways to like do the processes that I enjoyed in a way that was like smaller and like more chewable, I guess. Yeah, some more sort of process shots of like all the different pieces. I learned a lot about how to make things in multiples from this project. And then I sold a bunch of them just like casually online or through like some art and craft fairs around Rhode Island. And then I made a bunch more, which is kind of what I'm working on now in studio back east. That's surgery, because like, you know, you like spend all this time on a piece, and if something breaks, it's like more, it's a better use of time to try to fix it than to chunk it. And I think a lot of furniture making and being good at craft is like understanding how to fix things that you do wrong. Yeah, so kind of like testing out with different colors and shapes. So one of the cool things about this process is that I would make these blanks out of the like thicker plywood, and then I could use any color I wanted inside. And for this particular pattern, I could change the design as much as I wanted. Like this is another one where I had an initial version and then I was kind of riffing on the design, which was fun. Yeah, so I could like change out the colors as much as I wanted, and that prevented me from getting bored. And also people would sometimes ask for specific colors or like customs, which was always really cool for me to fabricate. Couple more. I made a bunch of different styles, and another kind of fun thing about it is that on the big sheets of plywood, I would design things that would nest within each other. So like these pieces, I had this weird like 2-inch or 3-inch space that would have just become scrap material. So I designed these pieces to sort of fit in that space. So it was kind of trying to be as like really optimize the material and the space that I had to get the most bang for my buck. This is another one that has some roaches on it. I think this was actually the first version of it. I had to there was a small cutting error with this one that I had to tweak, but yeah, trying to put gross bugs on my work and then see if people would buy it, which is kind of fun and interesting. Yeah, a couple more. There are a lot of different styles. And then here, so interestingly, so I'm trying to figure out, I'm sort of figuring out the language for talking about this component, which is the stuff that I'm interested in now. I'm still making all those mirrors back home, but it's become more of a production-based thing where there's not much creativity in it anymore because I'm just making them, and it's the same patterns, the same shapes, oftentimes the same colors. So I was kind of feeling like it was time for something more experimental and new and fun. And then while I was here, Genevieve and I were talking a lot about being goth, and sort of we did a goth show last night on KFGM, sort of thinking about mortality a lot. I don't know. And I guess I think it makes sense in the context of this site particularly. I had a really interesting sort of way of finding out about this site and this residency. So I think last year I read this book by Caitlin DeSilvey, which is called Curated Decay, after reading a really inflammatory article that posited that we should let Venice sink, the city, because of, I don't know. I think they were saying it was would be too difficult to keep it afloat with climate change and such, but they referenced her work in the article, and then I found her work and found the work was a lot less inflammatory and a lot more interesting for me conceptually. So I read her book, and the first chapter of the book is about the Moon Randolph Homestead, and it's she was the first curator of the homestead and was really instrumental in developing the curatorial philosophy for it as a site that sort of embraces decay and change in historic structures, and sort of also was responsible for sorting a lot of the detritus that was left by the families here and deciding what was to be kept and what was to be removed. I think this quote is really good. It's from an article that's actually linked on the Moon Randolph website if anyone wants to read it. But I'll just read it, I guess. Many of the homestead scraps would not let themselves be conscripted as evidence, and their contingent meaning could not survive the system I tried to place them in. Faced with these artifacts, I sensed shards of memory that seemed to have no place in the tidy narration of one farm's micro-history. I had come up against what Tony Bennett describes as a mismatch between the raw materials of history and the rhetorics governing the forms in which national pasts can fittingly be represented. So she's kind of thinking about, there was a lot of stuff here that wasn't explicitly a worthy object that represents the history of America. A lot of things that sort of were in varying states of decay, but still is indicative of the history of this place. So, yeah, I think that's interesting, and sort of thinking about a site like this as a more, I don't know the language, a more holistic way of engaging with history rather than the type of public history site that seeks to embalm the history in a particular point in time, or to preserve everything in a really frozen way. If you've ever been to a UNESCO World Heritage site, they kind of, it Disneyifies the place because it's so pristine and frozen and sort of for the viewers, and it's not really about the site itself anymore. So I was thinking about that a lot. I think it's really interesting. And sort of at the same time that I read the book, I went to this exhibit at the High Museum in Atlanta, which is the major, it's one of the biggest museums in the Southeast, I think. And they have this ongoing project called Picturing the South that's they've been doing it for 25 years. They commission different photographers around the South to do their thing and sort of show the landscape and history of the South through their own eyes, but they also collect a lot of historic photographs of the South. So I thought this was a really interesting photograph. I think it's from a rally from a sanitation site, sort of like a labor civil rights rally from the 60s. But I got really interested in photography and was thinking about how photographers kind of capture a moment in time, but in a way that's like through their own eyes, and was thinking about photography as a medium that like engages with history in a really special way. Another image from their collection, this is Sally Mann. She does a lot of imagery of her daughters, but also has some really strange, kind of haunted, ethereal landscapes too. Also, before I drove out here, I was gonna do some work for an artist in Providence, a photographer. She had a life-sized fiberglass taxidermy model of a horse that she wanted upholstered with fabric in like a skin-tight way that was gonna be the the background of a photograph. And I'd never really thought of photographers. I sort of was like, always had kind of thought about it as like, oh, you take a picture of a thing that's already there, but I never thought of it as like sort of working with sculpture where you build something and then take an interesting photo of it and the work is actually the photo. So that was kind of like a way of thinking and working that I was interested in coming out here. I didn't actually do the horse upholstery project. I had some like personal stuff come up, but it's kind of cool. And then I drove out here, which kind of gets me back to the idea of roads. There's like, I don't know, this is like a really big country. And it's like, I'd never been to this region before, and like seeing I came from Rhode Island, so I kind of hugged the Great Lakes and then went like across, I'm scared of the rain, whatever, across North Dakota and sort of saw the plains and everything change. And the scale of land is so crazy compared to Rhode Island, which is really small and dense, and Georgia too, which is like, because it's so densely forested, you never see the sky unbroken, and there's like hills and stuff. So it's like, the land feels smaller. And like driving out here was so bizarre because I would be in these really vast, I mean, y'all probably know, but like vast plains. And the only thing breaking the landscape is a road and then pylons and like wires and poles and stuff. So I thought that was like weird, and it's sort of like ended up dictating almost everything I've made out here. So kind of two things, last stuff. So Caitlin DeSilve has this idea in her book called palliative heritage, which is applying the ethos of palliative care to a historic site, which is more accepting of decay, change, and entropy, which is kind of like what's going on in this place. And as I was learning more about goth stuff out here, I feel like it's kind of a goth philosophy. And so I just thought it was really interesting, and it like really resonated with me as a way to like think about history and change and place, and also the work that I do as an artist. Like, instead of trying to make something that's archival or will last forever, like instead maybe making things that don't last forever or like change and decay. And then kind of last thing, I'm just gonna cover maybe. I started reading this book called Crossings while I was coming out here, that's by Ben Goldfarb, and it's about road ecology, which is like basically a discipline that like seeks to make roads better for animals. Like, they think a lot about how how roads bisect animal habitats, and how we can like use animal crossings or wildlife fencing or change the way that we do development to be more considerate of like non-human entities. And the first chapter of that book is about Montana and Missoula, and about the Yellowstone to Yukon pathway, which is an initiative to make like the road that goes from there to there, like to make animal habitats not be unbroken so that animals can migrate across those spaces. And that was like a serendipitous, strange thing to like be here. And then I'm like reading this book and it's about here also, but I didn't know that was going to be a thing. So as I've been reading this, I've been thinking a lot about roads and animals and infrastructure and fences and boundary lines and how all of those things kind of come together, and also how how roads change the way that animals live. I met one of the scientists that's interviewed in this book because he lives here, so I could just email him and like show up at his house, which was cool. And yeah, he taught me a lot about the work that he's doing and how sensitive ecologists are to like even the smallest creatures, and how like we can mitigate transportation development to be just not so bad for animals. So that was like really interesting. And then last thing is the work. So what I've been doing out here basically is I got all these letters at Home Resource, which I think were actually used for like marquee signs, either for gas stations or like fast food restaurants, like roadside signs basically. And I've been wanting to compile them to use as drawings or sculptures that would then be kind of the backing elements for photographs and video. So I sort of have been like compiling them together. Initially it was all going to be text-based because it's a lot of letters and I was going to spell stuff out and make it all about words, but then I decided I didn't want to do that, and it became really like image-based and trying to make symbols and glyphs out of the letters. And that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm like, it's a strange way of working for me because it's so different than furniture. It's like all about intuition and improvisation, which is the exact opposite of how I was trained and how I've like always done stuff. But it's, yeah, I'm just connecting these letters and numbers with wire and making like weird pylon shapes, buildings, glyphs, and then I'm gonna arrange them into compositions later this week and take some photographs with like the land in the background. I've also been drawing a lot of roads here. So yeah, that's kind of the main stuff. And then I have some like drawings that I've been doing, lots of printmaking too. And then some examples of the lettering up over yonder, but that's kind of the gist. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions for Reilly?
Yes, Genevieve.
The linoleum shapes, did you use the CNC router to cut those?
Yeah, so I was originally using the laser cutter, but then I learned that they may have, basically it could be a poisonous killing you type of thing. Yes. So CNC, but also sometimes I'll just do it by hand with chisels and like scissors because it's really thin, so you can like do it by hand, which was like a good craft challenge also. Yeah. Yes.
When you're putting the glass on the mirror, do you cut the shape of the glass, or it's put in the back?
It's okay. I don't really,
okay?
yeah,
I'm
it's
worried about
fine.
you with the electronic.
Oh, I didn't think, well, yeah, okay, sure. I went to this place, so the kind of the project was like an exercise in outsourcing stuff, and I went to this place in Providence that does custom glass, usually for like actual big projects, like architectural stuff, but it was really cheap to get some like pieces of glass cut, and I tried to always make the shapes be rectangles or squares, so it was like easy for them to cut and like cheaper. But yeah, I basically just got a place to do it for me. Yeah. Yeah, and like then the price of that would just get folded into this like selling stuff price. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there work available anywhere for purchasing now?
So I've been like working on an online shop for like a year, which I think I'm gonna do. I mostly have been just selling stuff on Instagram, but I'm like working on a big batch of stuff that I'm gonna hopefully like launch the online shop maybe later this summer. Yeah. Yeah, it's like a lot of website stuff, which isn't really my jam as much as like drawing something. So,
Yeah.
Any tips about what's not to be missed on the Moon Randolph homestead?
well, there's like a lot. Well, plug for my workshop tomorrow. There's a lot of interesting textures that I'm doing a like drawing workshop tomorrow where you like do rubbings of the textures, and I feel like that was like a really fun way for me to engage with the site because it like forced you to look at stuff at a micro scale. But mostly I've been like, I kind of thought I was going to be making really different work here, but I think because my tent is up there, I just end up like, I just like never want to leave that hilltop because it's fun to like watch people hike in and then to like just watch the weather change. It's so nice and peaceful. But also like if you come here on Saturday, I don't know, you can like go inside the buildings maybe more, which is also cool.
This is sort of random, but you know, I'm so fascinated by the idea of you as a child quilting.
Oh yeah.
Because I guess that's not something I think people learn until they're older.
Yeah.
Usually, can you talk more about like, do you have like a crazy collection of quilts that you made when you were really young, or?
So I don't know. It was really weird. I really wanted to learn how to sew when I was young, and this woman in my community did sewing and quilting camp every summer where like children go and sew from like 9 to 5 in the basement of a fabric store. And so I really liked the sewing camp, which was more about making like stuff rather than quilts only. Like it was like clothes, and you could make bags and things that were more dimensional, but I would do a lot of quilts. Mostly every summer I would make a quilt, and then I would take a hiatus during the school year. But sometimes I would make stuff as gifts for people. But I kind of have a quilt from like every summer from when I was like 8 until I was like 17. So that's kind of fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're sewing the chunks together with the quilt, is that hand stitched or you do it on?
It's on a machine. And then, well, you mean like the blocks? So that's all machined usually. And then for quilting, it's like all machine. The only part that's hand sewed is like when you sandwich everything together, you have to sew like an edge. It's called like the binding that goes around. And there's like one part of that you hand sew, but it's mostly machine. So it's like pretty quick and repetitive work in theory. It's really fun. But you can also hand sew, and it's like, that's also like cool.
Thank you so much for making it out tonight.